My brother fired me from our family's cafe to make room for his girlfriend the same morning I discovered she'd been stealing from the register for 3 months. "You're holding us back, Aria," he said, not even looking up from his laptop. "Natasha brings fresh energy to this place." I just smiled, knowing he had no idea I was the anonymous owner of the entire building his precious cafe sat in. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Aria Castellanos, and I'm 34 years old. Until about 20 minutes ago, I was the assistant manager of Moonrise Café, the cozy coffee shop nestled in the heart of Willowbrook's historic district, the same cafe where my grandmother, Esperanza, first taught me to brew the perfect cortado when I was 12. The same place where I'd spent every summer vacation learning the difference between a light roast and a dark roast, where I'd memorized every customer's order by heart, and where I'd poured my soul into creating the warm, welcoming atmosphere that had made us the most beloved coffee spot in 3 zip codes. But now, I was standing in the cramped office behind the main counter, watching my younger brother Cameron explain why my 15 years of dedication meant nothing compared to his 6-month relationship with a 23-year-old barista who couldn't tell espresso from instant coffee. "You're holding us back, Aria," he said, not even looking up from his laptop. "Natasha brings fresh energy to this place." I just smiled, knowing he had no idea I was the anonymous owner of the entire building his precious cafe sat in. "Look, Aria," Cameron continued, finally glancing up with those same green eyes we'd inherited from our father, except his held a coldness I'd never seen before. "Natasha has some really innovative ideas about social media marketing and customer engagement. She thinks we should rebrand, maybe add some trendy drinks, get with the times." I stared at him, processing the words that felt like they were coming from a stranger. Cameron wore a new button-down shirt I didn't recognize, and his hair was styled differently, slicked back in a way that made him look older, more serious. More like the business consultants who'd been circling Willowbrook's gentrifying downtown, like sharks sensing blood. "Rebrand?" I repeated slowly. "Cameron, our customers have been coming here for 20 years. Mrs. Holloway orders the same lavender honey latte every Tuesday at 2:15. The Riverside University students camp out here during finals because they know we'll keep their coffee warm and never rush them. Mr. and Mrs. Kim bring their grandchildren here every Saturday morning for hot chocolate and chess. This isn't just a business, it's a community hub." Cameron's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked slightly annoyed, like I was a difficult customer who didn't understand the menu. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "You're too sentimental about everything. Natasha showed me the numbers. We could increase our profit margins by 30% if we streamlined the menu, raised prices to match the market rate, and attracted a younger demographic. The old-timers don't spend enough money." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "The old-timers built this place, Cameron. They're the reason we survived when that corporate chain tried to move in 3 blocks away. They're the reason we didn't have to close during the pandemic when half the businesses on this street went under." "Things change, Aria." He stood up, smoothing his shirt like he was preparing for a presentation. "Dad left me in charge when he moved to Florida, and I'm making the decisions I think are best for our future. Natasha's going to take over your responsibilities, and honestly, I think a fresh perspective is exactly what we need." The words hit me like a slap. Our father, Diego, had indeed moved to Sunset Keys 6 months ago, after his heart attack, but he'd left the cafe to both of us. At least, that's what I'd thought. Apparently, Cameron had a different interpretation of our father's wishes. "What responsibilities?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Cameron, I run the morning shift. I train new employees, I handle vendor relationships, I manage inventory, I do the weekly deep cleans, And now Natasha will do all of that. She's eager to learn, and she doesn't have all the emotional baggage that you carry about this place. Emotional baggage. As if caring about our family's legacy was a character flaw. I looked around the small office, taking in the framed photos of 3 generations of Castellanos family members behind the counter, the handwritten recipe cards taped to the cabinet where Esperanza had noted the exact measurements for her signature churro batter, the faded newspaper clipping from 2018 when Moonrise had been voted best local coffee shop by the Willowbrook Herald. "Where is she now?" I asked. "Natasha? She's at a marketing seminar downtown, learning about digital customer acquisition strategies and brand positioning. You know, things that will actually help us grow instead of just maintaining." That's when I noticed it. The slight tremor in his voice when he said her name, the way his eyes softened just a fraction. Cameron wasn't just hiring his girlfriend. He was in love with her. The kind of desperate, all-consuming love that makes smart people do incredibly stupid things. And Natasha, who'd started working here 3 months ago with a bright smile and 0 coffee experience, had somehow convinced him that everything our family had built was worthless. I thought about the bank statements I'd seen last week when I was reconciling our supplier payments, the ones that showed cash deposits $200 to $300 short of what our register receipts indicated, the discrepancies that had started exactly 3 months ago, the same week Natasha had started working here. But I didn't say anything about that. Not yet. Instead, I smiled, really smiled, for the first time since this conversation had started. Because Cameron had no idea about the property deed tucked away in my safety deposit box at Willowbrook Community Bank. The deed that showed I'd purchased the building 5 years ago through Esperanza Holdings LLC, a shell company named after our grandmother. The same building that housed not just Moonrise Café, but also the vintage bookstore next door, the yoga studio upstairs, and the art gallery across the courtyard. Cameron thought he was firing his sister from the family business. What he was actually doing was evicting his biggest supporter from a property I could control with a single phone call to my property management company. "You know what, Cameron?" I said, reaching for my apron strings. "You're absolutely right. It is time for a change." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As I untied my apron for what Cameron thought would be the last time, I let my mind drift back to how we'd gotten here, how the little brother who used to beg me to teach him latte art had turned into someone I barely recognized. It had started 6 months ago, when our father, Diego, suffered his heart attack. The doctors in Willowbrook General had been blunt. Relocate somewhere with less stress and better weather, or risk another episode that might not have such a lucky outcome. Within 8 weeks, Dad was packing his life into a U-Haul bound for Sunset Keys, Florida, leaving behind the cafe that had been our family's heartbeat for over 2 decades. "You two can handle this," he'd said, standing in the middle of Moonrise's main dining area, surrounded by boxes of his personal items. "Aria, you know the business better than anyone. Cameron, you've got the vision for where it needs to go. Work together." Work together. If only he could see us now. Dad had transferred the business license and operational permits to both our names, making us equal partners in the day-to-day running of Moonrise Café. But what he didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I'd been preparing for this transition long before his heart attack forced the issue. 5 years ago, when the historic Willowbrook district started showing signs of gentrification, I'd watched nervously as property values began climbing and longtime businesses started getting priced out by aggressive rent increases. The vintage bookstore next door, Chapters in Verse, had nearly closed when their lease jumped 40% in a single year. The art gallery across our shared courtyard, Palette and Frame, had lost 2 months of business trying to negotiate with a new landlord who saw dollar signs instead of community value. That's when I'd made the decision that Cameron still didn't know about.
Using the inheritance I'd received from Esperanza's estate, money I'd kept separate from the cafe's finances, I'd quietly purchased the entire building through Esperanza Holdings, LLC. The shell company was registered in a neighboring county with all paperwork handled through my lawyer, Rebecca Torres, who specialized in small business acquisitions. To anyone checking public records, Esperanza Holdings looked like just another investment firm. Only Rebecca and I knew that the LLC was named after my grandmother and owned by the granddaughter who'd learned to make café con leche at her kitchen table. I'd kept the rent exactly the same for all the existing tenants, including Moonrise Café. In fact, I'd structured the leases specifically to protect the businesses that gave our corner its character. Chapters in Verse, run by the elderly couple Bernard and Rosalie Fletcher, had a locked-in rate for the next 7 years. Palette and Frame, owned by local artist Jade Minters, had a percentage-based rent tied to her actual sales, ensuring she'd never be priced out during slow months. The yoga studio upstairs, Mindful Movement, operated by instructor River Chen, had a sliding scale that reflected the seasonal nature of fitness businesses. I'd become the protector of our little corner of Willowbrook, the anonymous guardian ensuring that corporate developers couldn't sweep in and transform our community hub into another soulless strip of chain stores and overpriced boutiques.
But Cameron knew none of this. To him, I was just his older sister who'd never left their hometown, who clung too tightly to tradition, who couldn't see the potential for growth and modernization that Natasha had apparently opened his eyes to. Natasha Kovac had walked into our lives 3 months ago with a resume that was long on enthusiasm and short on actual coffee experience. She was 23, fresh out of college with a degree in digital marketing, and possessed the kind of confident energy that could convince you black was white if she smiled the right way while saying it. Cameron had been smitten from her first day when she'd suggested we needed a stronger social media presence and maybe some Instagram-worthy specialty drinks. The coffee industry is all about experience now, she told him during her second week, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her phone screen as she showed him photos of elaborate latte art from trendy shops in Seattle and Portland. People don't just want caffeine. They want something they can post about, something that makes them feel like they're part of something exclusive. I'd listened to this conversation from behind the espresso machine, grinding beans perhaps a little more aggressively than necessary. Exclusive. As if our cafe hadn't been creating genuine experiences for our customers for 20 years. As if the regulars who treated our corner tables like their personal offices weren't part of something special already. But Cameron had eaten it up. Within a month, Natasha had convinced him to let her redesign our chalkboard menu with fancier fonts and higher prices. She'd started an Instagram account for the cafe, posting filtered photos of our drinks with captions full of hashtags like #Willowbrook Vibes and #Artisan Coffee Life. She'd even suggested we replace our mismatched vintage furniture, the eclectic collection of chairs and tables that customers loved precisely because it felt like someone's grandmother's living room, with matching industrial pieces that would photograph better. We need to think about our brand identity, she'd explained using terms she'd clearly learned in marketing class. Cohesive aesthetic, target demographic optimization, a revenue stream diversification. And Cameron, who'd spent his childhood helping me arrange those same mismatched chairs and who'd once told me that the cafe's cozy chaos was what made it feel like home, nodded along like she was revealing profound truths about business. I'd watch my brother fall deeper under Natasha's influence with each passing week, seeing him transform from the laid-back guy who'd rather spend his afternoons reading behind the counter to someone who talked about maximizing our potential and leveraging our location in the historic district. The final straw had come 2 weeks ago when I'd found Natasha alone in the office after hours, supposedly organizing our filing system, except the cash drawer was open, and she was standing over it with a handful of 20s, looking startled when I walked in. "Oh, Aria," she'd said, her bright smile flickering for just a moment. Cameron asked me to count the till for tonight's deposit, just making sure everything matches the register receipts. But Cameron had left an hour earlier for his weekly basketball game with friends from high school, and the register receipts were sitting on the counter, nowhere near the cash drawer. I'd said nothing then, just smiled and told her I'd finished the closing procedures myself. But I'd started paying closer attention to our daily deposits, cross-referencing them with our sales receipts. The pattern was subtle but consistent, small amounts missing here and there, never enough to trigger immediate alarm, but totaling nearly $2,000 over the past 3 months. Now, standing in the office where I'd just been fired, I felt a strange sense of clarity settling over me. Cameron thought he was choosing love over family loyalty. What he was actually doing was choosing theft over integrity, style over substance, and potential profit over the community that had sustained us through every challenge we'd ever faced. He had no idea that his fresh start was about to become a very expensive lesson in the difference between owning a business and controlling the ground it sits on. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel of my old Honda Civic as I navigated the familiar streets of Willowbrook. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the maple trees that lined Rosewood Avenue, the same trees I'd climbed as a child while waiting for Dad to finish his evening inventory at the cafe. Everything looked exactly the same as it had this morning, but something fundamental had shifted in my world. My apartment was a modest 2-bedroom unit in a converted Victorian house, about 6 blocks from the cafe. I'd lived here for 8 years, choosing to stay close to work rather than chase the suburban dream that most of my high school classmates had pursued. The rent was reasonable, the landlord was kind, and I could walk to Moonrise in under 10 minutes, even faster if I cut through Riverside Park. But as I climbed the creaky wooden stairs to my front door, I wasn't thinking about convenience or nostalgia. I was thinking about the locked filing cabinet in my bedroom closet and the manila folder labeled property documents that Cameron had never seen. Inside my apartment, I made myself a cup of tea using the same blend we served at the cafe, a custom mix from Hartwell Tea Company that Esperanza had developed back in 2003. The familiar ritual of heating water, measuring leaves, and waiting for the perfect steep time helped calm my racing thoughts. I needed to think clearly about what came next. I pulled the filing cabinet from my closet and spread the documents across my dining room table. The deed to 847 Maple Street, the address that housed Moonrise Café, Chapters and Verse Bookstore, Palette and Frame Gallery, and Mindful Movement Yoga Studio. Purchased on March 15th, 5 years ago, for $340,000. Current market value, according to the latest assessment, $520,000. The property had been owned by the Whitman family for 60 years before I'd bought it. Old Henry Whitman had been Dad's landlord for most of my childhood, a fair man who understood that small businesses were the backbone of communities like Willowbrook. When Henry passed away, his son Marcus had inherited the building with very different ideas about profit margins and return on investment. Marcus Whitman had given all the tenants 6 months' notice that their rents would be doubling to reflect current market conditions. For most of the businesses, including Moonrise, this would have meant closure. We simply couldn't afford to operate with overhead that high, and none of our customers could afford the price increases we'd need to cover the costs. That's when I'd made the decision that even Dad didn't know about. I'd used my entire inheritance from Esperanza, $280,000 that I'd kept in a conservative investment account since her death 4 years earlier, plus a $60,000 loan against my 401k to make Marcus an offer he couldn't refuse. Cash purchase, 30-day closing, no financing contingencies. He'd taken the deal immediately, probably thrilled to wash his hands of what he considered a collection of low-revenue tenants. Rebecca Torres, my lawyer, had been the one to suggest creating the shell company. If you want to protect these businesses long-term, you don't want them to know you're their landlord. The moment personal relationships get mixed up with business arrangements, everything becomes complicated. Better to maintain professional distance.
So Esperanza Holdings LLC was born, named after the grandmother who taught me that sometimes protecting the people you love means making sacrifices they'll never know about. The company was registered in Pierce County, one county over from Willowbrook, with Rebecca's office address as the official headquarters. All rent payments went to a business checking account that I managed remotely, and all tenant communications came through a property management company called Riverside Assets. For 5 years, I had been the invisible hand, ensuring that our corner of Willowbrook remained affordable and stable. When Chapters and Verse needed new plumbing last winter, Esperanza Holdings had covered the cost and simply deducted it from their rent over 12 months. When Palette and Frame wanted to install better lighting for evening exhibitions, the company had split the electrical work costs with Jade. When Mindful Movement's enrollment dropped during the pandemic, I'd personally absorbed 3 months of reduced rent to keep River from having to close. I'd been the guardian angel of our small business community, and nobody, not even Dad, had any idea. The irony wasn't lost on me. Cameron had just fired me for being too sentimental about the cafe, for caring more about relationships than profit margins. He had no idea that my sentimentality had been the only thing standing between our family business and the kind of rent increases that killed dozens of other small shops throughout Willowbrook's historic district. I picked up the lease agreement between Esperanza Holdings and Moonrise Café, signed 5 years ago and renewed automatically each year. The monthly rent was $2,800, about 40% below current market rate for comparable retail space in the historic district. The lease included specific clauses about maintaining the building's character, preserving the existing tenant mix, and providing 90 days of notice for any significant changes. But here's what Cameron didn't know. The lease also included a clause that I insisted Rebecca add, something she'd called an operational consistency requirement. If the cafe's management or operational philosophy changed significantly from the community-focused model established under Diego Castellanos, Esperanza Holdings reserved the right to terminate the lease with 60 days of notice. I'd added that clause thinking about corporate chains that might try to buy out our lease and transform Moonrise into another generic coffee shop. I'd never imagined I'd need to use it against my own brother. I opened my laptop and logged into the Esperanza Holdings business account. The company currently held $47,000 in reserves, money I'd saved over 5 years by keeping the rents artificially low and investing the difference. I also reviewed the insurance policies, the property tax payments, and the maintenance agreements that kept the building running smoothly.
Then I did something I'd never done before. I researched the current market rate for retail space in Willowbrook's historic district. The numbers were staggering. Comparable properties were renting for $4,200 to $5,800 per month. Our little corner building, with its prime location and established foot traffic, could easily command $5,000 monthly for the cafe space alone. I sat back in my chair, staring at the numbers on my screen. Cameron thought he was inheriting a family business with reasonable overhead and guaranteed space. What he was actually running was a heavily subsidized operation that existed purely because his sister had been willing to sacrifice her personal financial future to keep it alive. Every month for 5 years, I'd been essentially giving our family $1,500 to $2,000 in free rent. That was money I could have used to buy my own house, take vacations, build a more substantial retirement fund, or start my own business. Instead, I'd invested it in preserving the community space that meant everything to me, and that Cameron was now ready to destroy in the name of fresh perspective. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Rebecca's number. My lawyer worked late most evenings, and I needed to understand exactly what options were available to me as the building's owner. "Aria?" Rebecca answered on the second ring. "This is unexpected. Is everything okay with the property?" "I need to know about the operational consistency clause," I said without preamble. "What would constitute a significant management change or operational philosophy?" There was a pause. "Has something happened at the cafe?" I told her about my firing, about Natasha's hiring, about the plan to rebrand and raise prices, and eliminate the community-focused elements that had made Moonrise special. I also told her about the missing cash deposits, though I kept that part brief. Well, Rebecca said slowly, firing the co-owner who established the operational model certainly qualifies as a significant management change. And if they're planning to alter the cafe's community focus in favor of profit maximization, that's exactly the kind of philosophical shift the clause was designed to address. What would happen if I invoked it? 60 days to vacate. But Aria, are you sure you want to? I'm not sure of anything yet. I just need to understand what tools are available. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment as the sun set outside my windows, thinking about power dynamics and family relationships, and the difference between owning something and controlling it. Cameron thought he'd just eliminated his biggest obstacle to transforming Moonrise into whatever vision Natasha had sold him. But Cameron had never learned the most important lesson our grandmother had tried to teach us. Real power isn't about commanding others. It's about having options when other people think you have none. I owned the ground he was standing on, and he was about to learn that foundation can shift when you least expect it. The phone calls started the next morning at 6:47 a.m., barely 12 hours after Cameron had escorted me out of what he thought was his cafe. The first was from Mrs. Holloway, whose Tuesday routine had been disrupted when she arrived for her usual lavender honey latte, only to find Natasha behind the counter, fumbling with the espresso machine and clearly having no idea how to make anything more complicated than drip coffee. Aria, dear, Mrs. Holloway's voice was strained through the phone. I don't want to cause trouble, but that young woman told me we don't make lavender drinks anymore. Said they're too niche for the new menu. I've been ordering the same drink for 6 years. What's happening over there? Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't sound like I was bad-mouthing my brother, Mrs. Holloway continued. And she charged me $7 for a regular latte. $7! Last week it was $4.50. She said they're implementing market competitive pricing, whatever that means. I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar knot forming in my stomach. $7. We'd always priced our drinks to be accessible to everyone in our community. The college students surviving on ramen budgets, the retirees on fixed incomes, the single parents who treated themselves to one good cup of coffee as their daily luxury. Natasha had just priced out half our customer base overnight. I'm sorry you had that experience, Mrs. Holloway, I said carefully. There might be some transition issues while they adjust to new procedures. The second call came 20 minutes later from Bernard Fletcher, who ran Chapters and Verse next door with his wife, Rosalie. Their bookstore shared a wall with Moonrise, and they'd been our closest business neighbors for over 15 years. Aria, I hope you don't mind me calling so early. Bernard's elderly voice carried concern. Rosalie and I couldn't help but notice some commotion yesterday evening. We saw you leaving with a box, and then this morning there was quite a bit of discussion coming through the walls. I could picture the scene. Cameron and Natasha arguing about procedures, trying to figure out which coffee beans went with which drinks, struggling with the temperamental espresso machine that required exactly the right touch to pull a perfect shot. That machine had been my domain for so long that I'd never bothered to write down detailed instructions for its quirks. Is everything all right? Bernard continued. The morning crowd seemed quite confused. Several of our regular customers asked us what was happening next door. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with another incoming call. The display showed River Chen from the yoga studio upstairs. Bernard, can I call you back? There's another call coming in. Of course, dear. But Aria, if there's anything Rosalie and I can do to help, please don't hesitate. I switched to River's call. Morning, River. Aria, thank God you answered. River's usually calm voice carried an edge of panic. I just came down to grab my usual pre-class chai, and it's chaos down there. The new girl doesn't know how to make chai, like at all. She tried to use a tea bag in hot water and called it a chai latte. When I explained that we usually use the concentrate you make fresh every Monday, she said they weren't doing custom orders anymore. My heart sank. The chai concentrate was one of my grandmother's recipes, a blend of black tea, cardamom, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves that I simmered for hours every Monday morning. It was River's pre-class ritual, but it was also popular with at least a dozen other customers throughout the week. And Aria, she continued, she told me the prices have gone up across the board. My chai went from $3.25 to $5.75. I teach yoga. I don't make tech money. How am I supposed to afford that? As River spoke, I could hear shouting in the background of her call, male voices raised in frustration, one of which sounded distinctly like Cameron. Is that coming from the cafe? I asked. Yeah, they've been arguing for 20 minutes, something about inventory and suppliers, and now the espresso machine is making that grinding noise it makes when someone tries to adjust the settings too quickly or uses the wrong technique. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, knowing exactly what grinding noise River meant. The espresso machine's grinder had a tendency to jam when someone tried to adjust the settings too quickly or use the wrong technique. It had taken me months to learn how to coax it back to working order, and I'd shown Cameron the procedure exactly twice in 15 years. Apparently, he hadn't been paying attention. My phone rang again immediately. This time, it was Luis Martinez, our primary coffee supplier from Hartwell Coffee Roasters. Aria, I've got your brother on my other line, and he's pretty upset. He's saying you guys want to cancel your standing order for the house blend and switch everything to some pre-ground commercial stuff from a warehouse supplier. Is that right? I felt my blood pressure spike. Our house blend was a custom roast that Luis had developed specifically for Moonrise 5 years ago. It was a medium roast with notes of chocolate and caramel that paired perfectly with steamed milk, and it had become our signature. Customers often bought bags to take home, and several other local businesses had started serving it because their customers requested that coffee from Moonrise. That's not my decision anymore, Luis, I said, hating how defeated I sounded. What do you mean? You've been my contact there for 8 years. You know coffee better than anyone in this town. Cameron is handling purchasing decisions now. There was a long pause. Aria, the stuff he's asking about costs 60% less than what you're buying from me, but it's also complete garbage. It's the kind of pre-ground bulk coffee that chain stores use. If Moonrise switches to that, you'll lose everything that makes your coffee special. After I hung up with Luis, I sat in my kitchen, staring at my phone as it continued to buzz with notifications. Text messages from customers, missed calls from other suppliers, even a voicemail from Jade at the art gallery asking if I knew why the coffee shop smells like burned beans this morning. Each call and message painted the same picture. Cameron and Natasha were systematically dismantling everything that had made Moonrise Café special, and they were doing it with the confidence of people who had no idea what they were destroying. By 10 a.m., I'd received 14 calls, 6 voicemails, and 23 text messages. The pattern was consistent. Confused customers, frustrated neighbors, concerned suppliers, and increasingly frantic attempts by Cameron to figure out basic operational procedures that I had been handling for over a decade. But the call that broke my heart came at 10:47 a.m. from Tommy Martinez, Luis's teenage son who worked part-time at the cafe during busy periods.
Miss Aria, Tommy's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm really sorry to bother you, but I'm supposed to come in for my shift at noon, and I don't know what to do. Your brother called and said they don't need extra help anymore because they're streamlining operations. But then Natasha called 20 minutes later asking if I could come in early because they can't figure out how to work the register system during rush periods. Tommy had been working at Moonrise for 2 years, saving money for college, while learning customer service skills that would serve him well in any future job. He was reliable, popular with customers, and one of the few employees who could handle both front counter work and basic drink preparation. She also asked me if I knew where you kept the recipe book for the specialty drinks, Tommy continued. She said they needed to reverse engineer your formulations. I told her I didn't know, but Miss Aria, she seemed really frustrated, like scary frustrated. The recipe book. I almost laughed despite everything. There was no recipe book for our specialty drinks because most of them lived in my head, passed down through years of experimentation and customer feedback. The lavender honey latte that Mrs. Holloway loves so much, I developed that recipe specifically for her after she mentioned missing a similar drink from a cafe in Portland. The seasonal pumpkin chai that brought customers back every fall, that was the result of dozens of attempts to balance spices in a way that tasted like autumn instead of artificial flavoring. Natasha could search the cafe from top to bottom and never find a written record of the drinks that had made us special, because those drinks existed in the relationship between me and the customers who'd inspired them. As I hung up with Tommy, I realized that Cameron hadn't just fired his sister. He'd fired the institutional memory of Moonrise Café. He'd eliminated the person who knew which customer preferred oat milk, who needed their coffee extra hot, who couldn't have caffeine after 2 p.m., who celebrated birthdays with free drinks, and who was going through a tough time and needed an extra smile with their order. He'd fired the person who knew that Mr. and Mrs. Kim's grandson was lactose intolerant, that Professor Williams from the university graded papers better with a double shot of espresso, that Sarah from the flower shop next block always ordered an extra pastry for her coworker who was too shy to come in herself. He'd fired 15 years of relationships, and Natasha couldn't Google her way to replacing that. My phone buzzed with another text message, this one from Cameron himself. Where do you keep the supplier contact list? Natasha can't find it. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Cameron wanted to run Moonrise without me? He was about to learn exactly what that meant. By Thursday afternoon, 2 days after my firing, I'd made a decision that would have surprised the Aria of a week ago. Instead of wallowing in my apartment or desperately calling Cameron to beg for my job back, I was sitting in Rebecca Torres's law office in downtown Willowbrook, surrounded by property documents, lease agreements, and a yellow legal pad covered with my handwriting. Rebecca's office occupied the second floor of a restored brick building that had once housed Willowbrook's first bank. The exposed brick walls and original hardwood floors gave the space a warmth that put clients at ease, but the law books lining the shelves and the framed degrees on the wall made it clear this was a place where serious business got done. Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly, Rebecca said, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed the timeline I'd provided. Cameron fired you on Tuesday morning to make room for his girlfriend, who has been systematically stealing from the cafe for 3 months. They've raised prices significantly, eliminated popular menu items, and plan to switch to inferior coffee suppliers to increase profit margins. That's correct, I confirmed. And you've documented evidence of the theft. I slid a manila folder across her desk. Inside were print and screenshots of our point-of-sale system, showing daily sales totals cross-referenced with bank deposit amounts. The discrepancies were highlighted in yellow, $150 short here, $240 short there, adding up to $1,847 over the past 93 days. I pulled these reports Tuesday night using my administrative access to the POS system. Cameron hasn't changed the passwords yet, probably because he doesn't know I have administrative privileges. Dad set up my access years ago for end-of-month reconciliation. Rebecca studied the numbers carefully. This is substantial evidence of employee theft. Have you considered filing a police report? Not yet. I wanted to understand all my options first. She nodded and turned to the property documents. As the building owner, you have several paths forward. The operational consistency clause gives you grounds to terminate their lease with 60 days' notice. But Aria, before we discuss that option, I need you to understand the implications.
Rebecca pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. If you invoke the lease termination, Cameron will have 2 months to either conform to the original operational model or vacate the premises. Given what you've told me about his current trajectory, conforming seems unlikely. And if he vacates? You'll need to find a new tenant for the cafe space or operate it yourself. The current lease generates $2,800 monthly in revenue for Esperanza Holdings. At market rate, you could charge $5,000 to $5,500, but you'd need to factor in the time and cost of finding a suitable tenant. I'd been thinking about this scenario since my conversation with her 2 days ago. What if I don't want just any tenant? What if I want to ensure the space continues serving the community the way Moonrise always has? Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying my face. Are you considering operating the cafe yourself? The question hung in the air between us. Was I? The idea had been forming slowly since Tuesday, crystallizing with each phone call from confused customers and frustrated neighbors. I had 15 years of operational experience, established relationships with suppliers and customers, and most importantly, I actually owned the building. Maybe, I said slowly, but I'd need to understand the legal requirements for that. Could I terminate Cameron's lease and then reopen under a different business name? Absolutely. As long as you provide proper notice and follow eviction procedures if necessary, you have full control over how that space is used. You could operate it yourself, lease it to someone else, or leave it vacant if you choose. Rebecca pulled out another folder from her filing cabinet. I've been doing some research since our call Tuesday night. There are several successful examples in Washington state of family members reclaiming businesses after partnership disputes. The key is documenting that the current operation has deviated substantially from the original operational model. She showed me 3 case studies where property owners had successfully terminated leases based on operational changes that violated the spirit of their rental agreements. In each case, the courts had sided with property owners who could prove that tenants had fundamentally altered the character of businesses in ways that affected the broader community. Your situation is actually stronger than most because you have documented evidence of both operational changes and financial misconduct. The theft alone could void their lease under the criminal activity clause. I hadn't even considered that angle. There's a criminal activity clause? Standard in most commercial leases. Any illegal activity conducted on the premises can result in immediate lease termination. Employee theft definitely qualifies. As Rebecca explained the various legal pathways available to me, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Tuesday morning, a sense of control. For 48 hours, I'd felt like a victim of Cameron's impulsive decision-making. Now I was beginning to understand that I actually held most of the cards in this situation. There's another factor we should discuss, Rebecca said, pulling out a thick folder labeled Willowbrook Historic District. I've been tracking development pressures in your area, and there are some things you should know about what's happening in your neighborhood. She spread out several documents, city planning reports, zoning change applications, and newspaper clippings about commercial development in historic Willowbrook. The pattern was clear and concerning. 3 major developers have been acquiring properties throughout the historic district over the past 18 months. They're buying buildings, evicting existing tenants, and converting the spaces to higher rent uses. That vintage clothing store on Pine Street? Now it's a boutique that sells $100 candles. The family restaurant on Oak Avenue? Replaced by a fusion concept with $30 entrees. I studied the map she'd marked with red dots indicating recent acquisitions. The developers were working systematically through the district, block by block, transforming Willowbrook from an affordable community hub into an upscale shopping destination. Your building sits right in the middle of their target zone. If they could acquire 847 Maple Street, they'd control most of the block. They could evict all the current tenants and redevelop the entire area. Have they approached Esperanza Holdings? Not yet, but they will. Properties like yours, with below-market leases and community-focused tenants, are exactly what they're looking for. They can offer inflated purchase prices because they know they can triple the rental income within a year. The implications hit me immediately. If I lost control of Moonrise Café, if Cameron's mismanagement forced the business to fail, it would create exactly the kind of vacancy that developers needed to justify buying out the entire building. They could approach me with an offer I might find difficult to refuse, especially if I was dealing with a failed business and lost rental income. But there was another possibility, one that Rebecca seemed to be leading me toward. However, she said, if you could demonstrate that the building supports a thriving community of small businesses with stable tenants and strong local support, that makes it much less attractive to developers. They want easy acquisitions, not community battles.
You think I should fight to keep the building community focused? I think you should consider that your ownership of this building gives you power, not just over Cameron's future, but over the future of your entire neighborhood. The question is, what do you want that future to look like? I looked out Rebecca's office window toward the historic district, where I could see the Moonrise Café sign 3 blocks away. From this distance, everything looked normal, peaceful, unchanged. But I knew that underneath that facade, my brother was struggling to hold together a business he didn't understand, while developers circled like vultures, waiting for any sign of weakness. I want to save it, I said quietly. All of it. The cafe, the bookstore, the gallery, the yoga studio, the whole community we've built. Rebecca smiled. Then we need to discuss your options for taking control of the cafe before Cameron runs it into the ground. Because once a business fails in that location, it becomes much harder to protect everything else. She pulled out a clean legal pad and uncapped her pen. Let's talk about timeline. How quickly can you be ready to operate Moonrise Café yourself? Friday morning found me sitting across from Miranda Walsh, Regional Director of Community Development for Willowbrook Credit Union, in her corner office overlooking the town square. Miranda was someone I'd known peripherally for years. She regularly stopped by Moonrise for her morning coffee and had always been friendly, but we'd never had a real conversation about business. That was about to change. I'd spent Thursday evening making a list of potential allies, people and organizations who had a vested interest in keeping Willowbrook's historic district authentically local rather than surrendering it to corporate development. The credit union topped that list because their mission statement explicitly includes supporting local businesses and maintaining community character. Aria, I have to say, I was surprised by your call, Miranda said, settling back in her chair with a steaming mug that bore the credit union's logo. She was in her early 40s, with prematurely gray hair that she wore in a practical bob and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. But after what I witnessed at Moonrise yesterday morning, I think I understand why you wanted to meet. What did you witness? Miranda's expression darkened. I went in for my usual Friday treat. You know, that cinnamon roll that pairs so perfectly with your medium roast. The young woman behind the counter told me they don't make cinnamon rolls anymore because they're, quote, too labor-intensive for the profit margin. Instead, she offered me a shrink-wrap pastry from some commercial supplier. I winced. Our cinnamon rolls were made fresh every morning using Esperanza's recipe, a process that started at 5 a.m. and filled the cafe with the kind of aroma that drew customers from 3 blocks away. They were indeed labor-intensive, requiring 2 rises and hand-rolled layers of butter and cinnamon. They were also one of our signature items and a significant revenue driver. That's not the worst part, Miranda continued. When I asked about the price change, my coffee and roll used to cost $6.50, now it was $11.20. She gave me this lecture about optimizing the customer experience for today's market expectations. I've been banking with the credit union for 15 years, Aria. I know corporate speak when I hear it. Miranda leaned forward, her tone shifting to business mode. So, when you called yesterday asking about small business loans and community development partnerships, I was very interested in what you had to say. Tell me about this proposal. I opened the folder I'd prepared, containing financial projections, market analysis, and a detailed business plan that I'd spent most of Thursday night developing. I want to operate Moonrise Café myself, maintaining the community-focused model that served Willowbrook for 20 years while also expanding our role as a community gathering space. And you'd need financing for this transition? Actually, no. I own the building through Esperanza Holdings, LLC. I saw Miranda's eyebrows rise slightly. What I need is a banking partner who understands the value of community-centered businesses, someone who can help me navigate the financial aspects of scaling up while staying true to our roots. I explained my vision, keeping the current cafe operation, but adding evening programming like poetry readings, acoustic music nights, and local art exhibitions, creating a community bulletin board for local businesses and services, hosting monthly town halls where residents could discuss neighborhood issues, offering meeting space for local organizations and study areas for students.
Basically, I concluded, I want to make Moonrise into what it's always been informally, the living room of Willowbrook's historic district. Miranda was taking notes as I spoke. This is exactly the kind of community development project that aligns with our mission. How familiar are you with our local business partnership program? I wasn't, but I listened carefully as she explained. The credit union offered below-market loans and business services to enterprises that demonstrated clear community benefit. They also provided business mentoring, marketing support, and connections to other local business owners who could offer mutual support.
More importantly, Miranda said, we've been looking for a flagship partner to anchor our new Keep Willowbrook Local initiative. We're concerned about the development pressure in the historic district, and we want to support businesses that can serve as examples of sustainable, community-focused commerce. This was better than I'd hoped. What would that partnership look like? Financial support, marketing collaboration, and policy advocacy. We'd feature Moonrise in our promotional materials as an example of the kind of business that makes Willowbrook special. We'd also provide business consultation services and connect you with other local business owners who share similar values. As Miranda spoke, I realized she was offering me something more valuable than money: legitimacy and institutional support. The credit union carried significant weight in local politics and community planning. Their endorsement could provide protection against the kind of development pressure that Rebecca had warned me about. There's someone else you should meet, Miranda said, reaching for her phone. Dr. Patricia Vance runs the Small Business Development Center at Riverside University. She's been working on a research project about preserving community character in the face of commercial development. I think she'd be very interested in your situation. The meeting with Dr. Vance took place that same afternoon in her office on the university campus. Patricia was a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and the kind of focused energy that suggested she'd built her career on turning ideas into action. Her office walls were covered with maps of small towns throughout the Pacific Northwest, each marked with colored pins indicating different types of commercial development patterns. Miranda tells me you're dealing with a family business situation that has broader implications for your neighborhood, Dr. Vance said after we'd settled into comfortable chairs near her window. I'd like to hear your perspective on what's happening in Willowbrook's historic district. I explained not just my personal situation with Cameron, but the pattern of development that Rebecca had shown me, the pressure on small businesses, and my concern that losing community-focused establishments would fundamentally change the character of our town. Dr. Vance nodded thoughtfully. You're describing a phenomenon we've documented in dozens of small communities throughout the region. The pattern is always the same. Economic pressure leads to business failures, which create vacancies, which attract developers who promise revitalization but deliver gentrification. She pulled out a thick research binder and showed me case studies from similar towns. Some had successfully resisted development pressure by organizing local business cooperatives and community support networks. Others had lost their historic character entirely, becoming expensive shopping destinations that served tourists rather than residents. The key factor, Dr. Vance explained, is whether communities can maintain anchor businesses that serve local needs rather than chasing tourist dollars or competing with chain stores on convenience alone. Anchor businesses? Establishments that provide essential services while also creating gathering spaces for community interaction. Coffee shops, bookstores, hardware stores, pharmacies. Businesses where people naturally congregate and form social connections. When you lose those anchor points, you lose community cohesion. Dr. Vance's research showed that communities with strong anchor businesses were more resilient against development pressure because residents had reasons to fight for preservation. When neighborhoods became collections of trendy boutiques and expensive restaurants, residents stopped feeling invested in their commercial districts. Your cafe could serve as an ideal anchor business, especially if you're committed to community programming and local partnerships. But you'd need support from other local business owners to create a network of mutual cooperation. That evening, I met with the other business owners in my building. Bernard and Rosalie Fletcher from Chapters and Verse, Jade Winters from Palette and Frame, and River Chen from Mindful Movement gathered in the bookstore after closing time, sitting among the stacks of novels and local history books while I explained what I'd learned about development pressures and community preservation strategies.
I've been wondering when someone would start connecting these dots, Bernard said, adjusting his reading glasses. Rosalie and I have watched 3 independent bookstores close in neighboring towns over the past 2 years, all replaced by businesses that cater to weekend visitors rather than daily readers. River nodded. The yoga community in Brookfield lost their studio last year when the rent tripled. Now the closest classes are 40 minutes away, and half my students can't make that drive regularly. Jade had been quiet during most of the conversation, but now she spoke up. I've been getting calls from art dealers in Seattle asking if I'm interested in selling original pieces to tourists instead of showcasing local artists. The profit margins would be higher, but it wouldn't be your gallery anymore. Exactly. I outlined my proposal. If I could successfully reclaim and operate Moonrise Café, I wanted to create formal partnerships with all the businesses in our building, cross-promotional marketing, shared community events, coordinated resistance to development pressure, and mutual support during economic challenges. Basically, I said, I want us to function as a cooperative network while maintaining our individual businesses, stronger together than separately.
Bernard smiled. Your grandmother would be proud of this idea, Aria. She always said that businesses should serve communities, not the other way around. By the time I drove home that evening, I had 3 business partnerships in place, institutional support from the credit union and the university, and a growing network of allies who shared my vision for preserving Willowbrook's authentic character. Cameron thought he was building a modern, profitable cafe with Natasha's help. What he was actually doing was demolishing the community connections that made our neighborhood worth preserving. But now I had the tools and support to build something better in its place. The question was no longer whether I could save Moonrise Café. The question was whether I could save it before Cameron's mismanagement gave developers the opening they needed to transform our entire block. Saturday morning, I did something I hadn't done in 15 years. I sat at a corner table in Moonrise Café as a customer instead of an employee. Armed with a notebook, my phone's voice recorder, and a carefully rehearsed story about being a freelance writer working on an article about local businesses, I ordered a simple coffee and settled in to document exactly what Cameron and Natasha had done to our family's legacy. The changes were immediately apparent. The mismatched vintage furniture that customers had loved, the overstuffed armchair where Professor Williams graded papers, the wobbly bistro table that the chess club had claimed as their own, the corner booth with the faded floral cushions where new mothers often nursed their babies, all of it had been replaced with sleek black tables and chairs that looked identical to every corporate coffee chain in America. The community bulletin board where local artists advertised shows, parents posted babysitting requests, and musicians found band members had been removed entirely. In its place hung a professionally printed menu with prices that made me wince. Basic coffee had jumped from $2.25 to $4.50. Specialty drinks now cost between $6 and $8, and the homemade pastries had been replaced with factory-made items priced at $5.50 each. But the real evidence I needed wasn't visible to casual observation. I'd come prepared with a specific plan. At 9:15 a.m., I approached the counter where Natasha was working alone, looking frazzled, as she tried to manage both the espresso machine and the register during what should have been the morning rush, except there wasn't really a rush anymore. In the 45 minutes I'd been sitting there, only 6 customers had come through the door, compared to the steady stream of 20 to 30 people who would normally cycle through during the same period. "Hi there," I said with a friendly smile. "I'm writing an article about how local businesses are adapting post-pandemic. Would you mind if I asked a few questions about your operations here?" Natasha's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm people show when they think they're about to get positive press coverage. "Of course! I'm actually the new manager here, and we've been implementing some really exciting changes." I pulled out my notebook, making sure my phone was recording in my pocket. "That's great! Can you tell me about some of those changes?" For the next 20 minutes, Natasha provided me with a detailed confession of everything she and Cameron had done wrong, though she presented it all as innovative business strategy. She explained how they'd streamlined the menu to focus on high-margin items, which meant eliminating everything that required skilled preparation. She described their
price optimization strategy, which had doubled costs across the board to align with premium market positioning. Most damaging was her proud description of their operational efficiency improvements. They'd terminated their relationships with local suppliers in favor of a single commercial distributor who delivered pre-ground coffee, frozen pastries, and shelf-stable milk alternatives. The custom tea blends were gone, replaced with generic tea bags. The fresh-baked goods were now delivered twice weekly by truck from a facility 3 states away. "We've reduced our prep time by 70%, she said with obvious pride. "Instead of coming in at 5 a.m. to bake and brew custom blends, I can open at 7 with everything ready to go. It's so much more sustainable for work-life balance." I nodded and took careful notes, asking follow-up questions that encouraged her to provide even more detail about their cost-cutting measures. She showed me spreadsheets on her phone demonstrating how their profit margins had improved, completely oblivious to the fact that profits had only increased because they eliminated the labor and ingredient costs that made their products worth buying in the first place. The most revealing moment came when I asked about customer feedback. "Oh, there's been some resistance to change," Natasha admitted, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "You know how it is with small towns. People get stuck in old routines. But we're confident that once they adjust to the new offerings, they'll appreciate the improvements. Some of the older customers have been complaining about prices, but honestly, they weren't spending enough money to justify keeping prices artificially low."
I asked her to elaborate on the customer complaints, and she pulled out a small notebook where she'd been tracking feedback. Reading over her shoulder, I could see comments like, "Tastes like dishwater," "Where are the cinnamon rolls?" and "This isn't the same place anymore," written in her neat handwriting, followed by her own dismissive responses. But the most damaging evidence came when I asked about staffing changes. "We've really streamlined our team," Natasha explained. "The previous management was overstaffed and underutilizing human resources. We had people coming in just to do prep work and specialty baking, which is totally unnecessary when you can source those items more efficiently." She showed me a staffing chart that revealed they'd eliminated 4 part-time positions, including Tommy Martinez and Sarah Kim, a college student who'd been learning coffee roasting techniques under my supervision. The remaining staff had been reduced to minimum wage positions with no opportunity for skill development or advancement. "What about the previous manager?" I asked casually. "Did she transition to a different role?" Natasha's expression flickered with something that might have been guilt before the confident smile returned. "That was Cameron's sister, actually. Family dynamics can be complicated in small businesses. She was resistant to modernization. Sometimes you have to make difficult personnel decisions for the good of the company." As our conversation continued, I gathered evidence of every mistake they'd made. Alienated customers, eliminated local suppliers, fired experienced staff, raised prices beyond community affordability, and replaced quality products with inferior alternatives. But more importantly, I was documenting their attitude toward the community they claimed to serve. After leaving the cafe, I spent the rest of Saturday conducting what I privately called community impact interviews. I visited 8 other businesses within a 3-block radius, speaking with owners and employees about how the changes at Moonrise had affected their operations. The pattern was consistent and alarming. Bernard Fletcher reported that his afternoon coffee sales had dropped 60% because customers no longer lingered at Moonrise to read. Jade's Gallery had lost its regular art walk attendees who used to start their evening at the cafe. River mentioned that several yoga students had stopped coming to morning classes because their post-workout coffee ritual had become unaffordable. Most concerning was my conversation with Elena Rodriguez, who owned Willowbrook Flowers 2 blocks away. She'd been sending customers to Moonrise for 15 years when they wanted to wait comfortably while special orders were prepared. "I've had 3 different customers this week ask me if I know what happened over there," Elena said, shaking her head. "One woman told me she felt unwelcome when she tried to nurse her baby. Apparently, the new management told her it was inappropriate for the atmosphere they're trying to create. Another customer said they were told they couldn't use their laptop because tables are for active customers only."
These weren't just business decisions. They were community policy changes that fundamentally altered how public space functioned in our neighborhood. Moonrise had always been the place where people felt comfortable existing without constantly spending money, where mothers could feed their children, where students could study, where elderly residents could sit with the morning paper for an hour. Sunday morning, I compiled everything into a comprehensive report: recorded interviews, customer feedback documentation, financial impact analysis, and photographs showing the physical changes to the space. I also researched comparable businesses in the region to demonstrate how Moonrise's new pricing structure compared to other community-focused cafes. The evidence was overwhelming. In less than a week, Cameron and Natasha had transformed a beloved community gathering place into a generic coffee shop that served no one well. Not the customers who couldn't afford the new prices, not the employees who had lost their jobs or seen their roles diminished, and ultimately not even Cameron himself, whose daily revenue had dropped by 30% despite the higher per-item prices. But the most damaging evidence was still to come. Sunday evening, I received a text message from Luis Martinez at Hartwell Coffee Roasters. "Aria, I need to talk to you about your brother's account. There's something you should know." We met at Luis's roasting facility Monday morning, where he showed me bounced payment notices and contract disputes that revealed just how badly Cameron was managing the business side of operations. But more importantly, Luis had been tracking some concerning patterns in Cameron's orders and payment behavior. "He's been asking about cash discounts," Luis explained, showing me email exchanges. "Wants to pay for orders with cash instead of checks, says it's for streamlining accounting procedures. But Aria, cash payments aren't how legitimate businesses operate anymore, especially not for orders this size." The implication was clear. Cameron was looking for ways to move money without creating paper trails. Combined with Natasha's theft and their elimination of multiple revenue tracking systems, it suggested financial irregularities that went beyond simple mismanagement.
The question was no longer whether I could document what they'd done wrong. The question was how quickly I could act before their mismanagement created legal problems that could jeopardize my ability to save the business at all. The call came Tuesday morning at 7:43 a.m., exactly 1 week after Cameron had fired me. I was sitting on my apartment balcony with a cup of coffee from Hartwell's. I couldn't bring myself to buy beans from the corporate supplier that had replaced our local roaster, when my phone buzzed with Cameron's contact information. "Aria, we need to talk." His voice carried a strain I hadn't heard since his college years when he'd called Dad to confess he'd totaled his car. "Can you meet me at the cafe this afternoon, say 2 o'clock? I kept my voice carefully neutral. "What's this about, Cameron?" "Just, there are some things we need to discuss. Business things. I think maybe I was hasty about some decisions last week." Hasty. As if firing your sister and destroying a family legacy was equivalent to choosing the wrong shirt for a meeting. "I'll be there," I said simply. After hanging up, I immediately called Rebecca Torres. "Cameron wants to meet this afternoon. I think he's starting to realize how badly things are going." "Are you prepared for what he might offer you?" Rebecca asked. "He could try to rehire you, ask you to come back as an employee, maybe even offer you a partnership position. But Aria, if you've decided to pursue reclaiming the cafe through the lease termination, you need to be clear about your position." I'd been thinking about this moment for days. I'm not going back as his employee. If I'm going to save Moonrise, it has to be on my terms. Then stick to that. Don't let family emotions override your business judgment. I spent the morning reviewing my evidence files one more time, organizing documents into clear categories, and preparing for what would likely be the most difficult conversation I'd ever had with my brother. But I also did something else. I called Miranda Walsh at the credit union and Dr. Patricia Vance at the university, giving them advance notice that today might be the day I committed to moving forward with reclaiming the cafe.
"We're ready to support you," Miranda assured me. "The loan pre-approval is sitting on my desk, and our marketing team has already drafted preliminary materials for the partnership announcement." At 1:45 p.m., I parked across the street from Moonrise and observed the scene before going inside. The lunch crowd, what little remained of it, was dispersing. Through the windows, I could see Cameron sitting at what used to be our family's corner table, the spot where Dad used to spread out invoices and paperwork during slow afternoons. Cameron looked older than his 29 years, his previously confident posture replaced by the slouched shoulders of someone carrying unexpected weight. Natasha was behind the counter, but something was different about her usual bright demeanor. Her movements seemed agitated, and even from across the street, I could see tension in her body language as she cleaned the same section of counter repeatedly. I crossed the street and entered the cafe, immediately noticing that the afternoon atmosphere felt hollow. The space looked the same as it had during my undercover visit Saturday, but now it felt actively uncomfortable rather than merely disappointing. Two customers sat at separate tables, both looking like they were trying to finish their drinks quickly rather than savoring the experience. Cameron looked up when I entered, relief flooding his face. "Aria, thank you for coming." I sat across from him, placing my folder of documents on the table, but keeping it closed. "You said you wanted to discuss business things." He glanced toward the counter where Natasha was pretending not to listen to our conversation. "Maybe we could talk in the office." "This is fine," I said firmly. "What did you want to discuss?" Cameron ran his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I remembered from childhood. "Look, I'll be honest. This past week has been challenging. Some of the changes we made haven't gone as smoothly as expected." I waited for him to continue, offering no help or encouragement. "The customer response has been more negative than we anticipated, and there have been some operational issues that I didn't foresee. Supply chain problems, staffing challenges, that kind of thing." "What kind of operational issues?" Cameron's discomfort was visible. "The new coffee supplier has been inconsistent with delivery schedules. The espresso machine keeps malfunctioning, and apparently the repair technician needs some kind of specialized knowledge about the model that I don't have. We've had to throw away about 40% of our pastry orders because customers aren't buying them as quickly as projected." Each problem he described was entirely predictable, the result of decisions that any experienced cafe operator could have warned him against. But I simply nodded and said, "I see." "And then there are the financial aspects that are proving more complicated than expected." This was new territory. Financial aspects.
Cameron lowered his voice, glancing again toward Natasha. "The bank called yesterday about some discrepancies in our deposit records. They want to schedule a meeting to review our accounting procedures. And our landlord's property management company sent a notice about conducting some kind of operational review related to our lease terms." My pulse quickened. Riverside Assets, the property management company I had hired to handle communications with tenants, had apparently begun the preliminary lease review process that would precede formal termination proceedings if necessary. "What did the landlord notice say exactly?" I asked. "Something about verifying that current operations align with the community-focused business model specified in our lease agreement. It mentioned scheduling a site visit and requesting documentation about our operational procedures and customer service policies." I had to work to keep my expression neutral. Rebecca and I had discussed this approach. Rather than moving directly to lease termination, we'd first create an official record of the operational changes that violated the lease terms. This would provide additional legal protection if Cameron tried to challenge the termination later. "That seems routine," I said. "Property management companies probably do regular check-ins with commercial tenants." "Maybe, but the timing feels coincidental, right when we're dealing with other challenges." Cameron leaned forward, lowering his voice further. "Aria, I think I may have made some mistakes. The changes we implemented were supposed to improve our profitability, but instead our daily revenue has dropped significantly. And some of the operational decisions..." He trailed off, looking toward Natasha again. "What operational decisions?"
There have been some issues with cash handling procedures, discrepancies between register totals and deposit amounts. Natasha says it's probably just errors in the new accounting system, but the bank is asking questions that I don't know how to answer. So Cameron was finally noticing the theft that had been happening for months. But instead of confronting Natasha directly, he was hoping I would help him figure out what to do about it. "What are you asking me, Cameron?" He met my eyes for the first time since I'd sat down. "I'm asking if you'd consider coming back. Not as an employee," he added quickly, "but as a partner. Equal decision-making authority, shared responsibility for operations, maybe even a larger ownership stake in the business." There it was, the offer I'd been expecting but dreading. Cameron was scared enough to give up the control he'd fought so hard to claim, but he still didn't understand that the problems went deeper than staffing or operational procedures. "What about Natasha?" I asked. Cameron's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We could restructure her role, maybe move her to a more marketing-focused position, less direct operational responsibility." "So you'd demote your girlfriend to hire back the sister you fired last week?" "I'd make the changes necessary to save our family's business," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I looked around the cafe, taking in the sterile corporate aesthetic, the overpriced menu board, the empty tables that should have been full during afternoon coffee hour. Then I looked back at my brother, seeing not the confident young man who dismissed me as too sentimental, but a scared kid who'd finally realized he was in over his head. "Cameron, what makes you think this business is still salvageable?" His face went pale. "What do you mean?" I opened my folder and pulled out the top sheet, a summary of the customer interviews I'd conducted, showing the dramatic decline in community satisfaction and loyalty. "In 1 week, you've managed to alienate most of your regular customers, eliminate the operational systems that made this place special, and create financial irregularities that have attracted bank scrutiny." He stared at the documents, his face growing paler as he read the customer comments. "Where did you get this?" "I've been documenting the impact of your changes. Community impact, financial impact, operational impact." I pulled out more sheets, laying them systematically on the table. "This cafe isn't just struggling, Cameron. It's failing." "But we could fix it," he said desperately. "If you came back, we could restore the old systems, rebuild customer relations, address the financial issues." I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw someone who still didn't understand what he'd broken or why it couldn't simply be repaired. "Cameron, some things can't be fixed. They can only be replaced." Cameron stared at the documents spread across the table, his confident facade crumbling with each page he reviewed. Customer complaints, financial discrepancies, supplier problems, all laid out in clinical detail that made his week of modernization look like systematic destruction. "This can't be right," he said, his voice barely higher than a whisper. "The profit margins show we're making more money per transaction." "Higher margins on fewer transactions equals lower total revenue. But that's not even the biggest problem you're facing." I reached into my folder and pulled out a different set of documents, ones that would change the entire dynamic of our conversation. "Cameron, do you know who owns this building?" He looked up from the customer feedback sheets, confusion replacing desperation on his face. "What does that have to do with anything? We have a lease. The property management company handles building issues."
Riverside Assets is the management company, yes, but they work for the actual owner. I placed a document on the table between us. Esperanza Holdings, LLC, registered in Pierce County 5 years ago. Cameron glanced at the property deed, but I could see he wasn't really processing what it meant. "Okay, so some investment company owns the building? Aria, I don't understand why you're—" "Look at the signature on the purchase agreement." He picked up the deed and examined it more carefully. I watched his face as he read the buyer's information, saw the exact moment when the name registered. His eyes widened, and he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning comprehension. Esperanza Holdings, named after grandmother? Yes. You. It wasn't a question. You own this building? I own this building. The color drained from Cameron's face as the implications hit him. Behind the counter, Natasha had stopped pretending not to listen and was staring at us with obvious alarm. For how long? 5 years. I bought it when the Whitman family was going to double everyone's rent. I've been your landlord this entire time, Cameron. Moonrise Café has been paying rent to a company I own. I pulled out more documents. 5 years of rent payments, property maintenance records, tax assessments. The market rate for this space is $5,500 a month. You've been paying $2,800 because I chose to subsidize our family's business. Cameron was staring at the rent comparisons like they were written in a foreign language. But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't Dad know? Because the moment family relationships get mixed up with business arrangements, everything becomes complicated. I echoed Rebecca's words from weeks ago. I wanted to protect this place and all the other businesses in the building without anyone feeling like they owed me personal favors. All the other businesses? Chapters and verse, palette and frame, mindful movement, I've been keeping their rents affordable too. This entire corner of Willowbrook's historic district has been protected from development pressure because I chose to prioritize community over profit. I watched as Cameron processed this information, seeing him realize that his dramatic firing of his sentimental sister had actually been an attack on the person who'd been quietly saving his business for years. The lease review notice, he said suddenly. That was from you? That was from Riverside Assets, acting on behalf of Esperanza Holdings, conducting a routine review of lease compliance. I pulled out the relevant clause and placed it in front of him. Operational consistency requirement. If the cafe's management or operational philosophy changes significantly from the community-focused model established under Diego Castellanos, the landlord reserves the right to terminate the lease with 60 days' notice. Cameron read the clause twice, his hands shaking slightly. You're going to evict me? I'm going to enforce the terms of your lease, I corrected. You've eliminated community programming, priced out local customers, fired experienced staff, terminated relationships with local suppliers, and created an unwelcoming environment for the people this cafe was designed to serve. That constitutes a significant change from the operational model. But you just offered to help me fix it, he said desperately. You said we could work together as partners. No, Cameron, you offered to make me your partner after you realized you needed me to save the business you thought you could run without me. There's a difference. I gathered the documents and placed them back in my folder, leaving only the lease termination notice on the table. You have 60 days to either restore the community-focused operational model that was specified in your lease agreement or vacate the premises. Cameron's voice rose in panic. Aria, you can't do this. This is our family's business. Dad trusted us to preserve what grandmother built. You chose to tear it down and rebuild it as something entirely else, something that serves no one well. Not the customers, not the community, not even you. For the first time since I'd arrived, Natasha spoke up. Cameron, maybe we should call a lawyer. This seems like some kind of illegal retaliation. I turned to look at her directly. Miss Kovach, I have documentation showing that you've stolen approximately $1,800 from this business over the past 3 months. I've shared that information with both Cameron and the relevant authorities. I'd suggest you focus on your own legal situation rather than offering business advice. Natasha's face went white, and she looked at Cameron with an expression that clearly expected him to defend her. When Cameron remained silent, staring at the termination notice, her shock turned to anger. Cameron, are you just going to let her threaten me after everything I've done to help modernize this place? Cameron finally looked up from the documents. Natasha, did you take money from the register? There were some accounting errors when we switched systems. I was going to discuss it with you when Did you take money from the register? His voice was harder now, carrying an authority I hadn't heard from him before. Natasha's silence was answer enough.
Cameron turned back to me, and I could see something had shifted in his expression. The desperate panic was still there, but underneath it was a growing understanding of how completely he'd been manipulated. 60 days, he said quietly. 60 days to restore the operational model, or 60 days to vacate. Your choice. And if I choose to vacate, then I'll operate the cafe myself, maintaining the community-focused model that made this place special, preserving the relationships with local suppliers and customers that you've been systematically destroying. I stood up, leaving the lease termination notice on the table. I've already secured financing and operational support from Willowbrook Credit Union and the Small Business Development Center at Riverside University. The other business owners in the building have committed to partnership agreements that will strengthen our collective resistance to development pressure. Cameron looked around the cafe as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The sterile corporate aesthetic, the overpriced menu, the empty tables that should have been full of community members. You've been planning this. I've been preparing to save what you seemed determined to destroy. What about the theft? What about Natasha? I glanced toward the counter where Natasha was now openly crying, apparently realizing that her influence over Cameron had just evaporated along with her job security. That's between you and her, and between both of you and law enforcement. But Cameron, if you're thinking about trying to restore the old operational model to keep your lease, you should know that I'll be monitoring compliance very carefully. Half measures and temporary changes won't be sufficient. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to my brother. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it came to this, but you made choices that forced my hand. I won't let our family's legacy be destroyed just because you fell in love with someone who saw dollar signs instead of community value. Cameron was still sitting at the table, staring at the termination notice when I left the cafe. Through the window, I could see Natasha approaching him, probably trying to salvage her position, but her body language suggested he was no longer listening to her advice. 60 days. It wasn't enough time to undo all the damage they'd done, but it was enough time for Cameron to decide whether he wanted to fight for something worth preserving or walk away from something he'd never really understood. Either way, Moonrise Café would survive. The only question was whether it would survive with him or without him. I was halfway home when my phone started buzzing with calls and text messages. The first was from Tommy Martinez, whose shift had been scheduled to start at 3 p.m. Miss Aria, I'm standing outside the cafe and it's locked up tight. There's a sign that says, closed for family emergency, but I can see Cameron inside talking to someone on the phone. Should I still come in for my shift? I told Tommy to go home and that I'd call him later with an update about his employment status. Then I turned around and drove back toward Moonrise, parking across the street to observe what was happening in the aftermath of our confrontation. Through the windows, I could see Cameron pacing behind the counter, his phone pressed to his ear in what looked like an intense conversation. Natasha was nowhere visible, but her purse and jacket were still on the back counter, suggesting that she hadn't left permanently yet. The closed sign hanging in the window was hastily written on a piece of receipt paper, clearly a last-minute decision. My phone rang again. This time it was from Bernard Fletcher from the bookstore. Aria, dear, there's quite a commotion next door. We heard raised voices about an hour ago, and now the cafe is closed in the middle of the afternoon. Is everything all right? I explained briefly that there had been some family business discussions and that changes might be coming to Moonrise's operations. Bernard, with the discretion that comes from 40 years of running a business, didn't press for details, but I could hear his concern in his voice. Well, whatever's happening, Rosalie and I want you to know that we support you completely. This neighborhood needs someone who understands what makes it special. The next call came from an unexpected source, Dad, calling from Florida. His voice carried the strain of someone who'd been dragged into a situation he didn't fully understand. Aria, Cameron just called me. He's very upset, saying something about lease problems and property ownership. He claims you're trying to evict him from the cafe. What's going on up there? I took a deep breath, knowing this conversation had been inevitable since the moment I decided to reveal my building ownership. Dad, Cameron made some significant changes to how the cafe operates. Changes that violated the terms of his lease and damaged relationships with the community. His lease? Aria, what lease? We own the business outright. You own the business.
I own the building it operates in. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice quiet and careful.
You bought the Whitman building? 5 years ago, when Marcus was going to double everyone's rent. I used grandmother's inheritance to purchase it through a shell company. Another long pause. And you never told me. I never told anyone. The goal was to protect local businesses without creating personal obligations or complicated family dynamics. But now there are complicated family dynamics. I watched Cameron through the cafe windows as he continued his phone call, gesturing emphatically at someone I couldn't see. Now, Cameron has destroyed the community-focused business model that made Moonrise special. And I have to decide whether to let him continue damaging our family's legacy or take action to preserve it. Dad sighed heavily. What kind of action? I explained the lease termination process, the 60-day notice, and the evidence I'd gathered about Cameron's operational changes. I also told him about Natasha's theft, which seemed to hit him harder than the property ownership revelation. Christ, Aria, how did we get here? Cameron fell in love with someone who convinced him that community relationships were obstacles to profit maximization. He chose to believe her instead of trusting the systems that had sustained us for 20 years. And now, you're choosing to evict your own brother. I'm choosing to save Moonrise Café before Cameron's mismanagement destroys it completely. After I hung up with Dad, I sat in my car watching the drama unfold inside the cafe. Around 4 p.m., Natasha emerged from the back office carrying a box of personal items, her face red and blotchy from crying. She walked out the front door without looking back, and I could see Cameron through the window, slumped in a chair with his head in his hands. My phone rang again. Miranda from the credit union. Aria, I just had an interesting call from someone claiming to represent Moonrise Café, asking about emergency business loans to cover lease disputes and operational shortfalls. They mentioned your name as a reference, but given our conversation last week, I wanted to check with you before responding. Cameron's scrambling for financial solutions to problems that can't be solved with money, I told her. I'd recommend not extending any credit based on my recommendation unless we've had a chance to discuss the current situation. Understood. Are you still planning to move forward with our partnership discussions? More than ever. Around 5 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text message from Cameron. We need to talk again. Can you come back to the cafe? I waited 30 minutes before responding. I'll be there at 6. When I returned to Moonrise, I found Cameron sitting alone in the empty cafe, surrounded by paperwork that I recognized as financial records, supplier contracts, and employee files. The afternoon light streaming through the windows highlighted the changes he'd made to the space, making the corporate aesthetic look even more sterile and unwelcoming. Natasha's gone, he said without looking up when I entered. Cleared out her stuff and said she was going back to Seattle. Apparently she has a friend there who runs a marketing agency. I sat down across from him, noting that he'd chosen a different table this time, not the family corner where we'd had our earlier confrontation. What did you want to discuss? He said, gesturing to the paper spread around him. I've been going through the numbers. Really going through them, not just looking at the profit margin calculations that Natasha showed me. He pulled out a spreadsheet that I recognized as our customer tracking system. We've lost 67% of our regular customers in 1 week. 67%, Aria. People who came here multiple times a week for years. I know. The daily revenue has dropped from an average of $840 to $320. Even with the higher per-item prices, we're making less than half what we were making before. He showed me supplier invoices and staff schedules. The commercial coffee supplier delivered beans that half of our remaining customers have complained about. The frozen pastries cost less per unit, but we're throwing away 80% of them because nobody's buying them. And the staff cuts meant I've been working 16-hour days trying to cover shifts. Cameron looked up at me for the first time since I'd arrived. We destroyed everything, didn't we? You made choices based on advice from someone who didn't understand what made this place special. She told you you were holding the business back because you were too emotional about tradition. She said successful coffee shops needed to focus on efficiency and profitability instead of catering to customers who weren't spending enough money. I remained silent, letting him work through his realizations.
But those customers were spending enough money, he continued. They were spending consistently, bringing friends, staying loyal through slow periods, recommending us to newcomers. The high-spending customers we were supposed to attract with the premium pricing, they never materialized. Cameron gathered the financial documents into a pile. I called 3 different business consultants this afternoon, trying to figure out how to fix what I'd broken. All 3 of them told me the same thing. You can't rebuild customer loyalty quickly, you can't restore community relationships overnight, and you can't undo reputation damage with marketing campaigns. He met my eyes directly. They also told me that even if I could fix the operational problems, I'd need at least 6 months of operating capital to survive the transition period while customers decided to trust us again. Capital I don't have. What are you saying, Cameron? I'm saying I can't meet the terms of the lease restoration. I don't have the expertise to rebuild what I tore down. I don't have the money to sustain the business during a recovery period. And I don't have the community relationships necessary to regain customer trust. He pushed a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a handwritten letter on cafe letterhead. I'm saying I'm voluntarily terminating the lease, effective immediately. I picked up the letter and read Cameron's formal surrender of the business that had defined our family for 2 decades. His signature at the bottom looked smaller and less confident than I'd ever seen it. What will you do? Cameron looked around the cafe one last time. I don't know yet. Maybe go back to school, get an MBA, learn how to actually run a business before I try to take over someone else's life work. He stood up and walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not just for firing you, but for not listening to you, for not respecting what you'd built here, for letting someone convince me that profit was more important than people. Cameron? No, let me finish. You spent 5 years protecting this place, protecting me, protecting our whole community. And I repaid that by trying to destroy everything you'd worked to preserve. He opened the door, letting in the cool evening air. I hope you can rebuild what I broke, and I hope someday I'll be worthy of being your brother again. After Cameron left, I sat alone in the quiet cafe, surrounded by the remnants of his week-long attempt to modernize our family's legacy. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of restoring Moonrise Café to what it had always been meant to be. But tonight, I mourned the relationship that had been broken along with everything else. 3 days after Cameron handed me the keys to Moonrise, I stood in the cafe at 5 a.m., surrounded by the smell of fresh paint and the sound of Luis Martinez's espresso machine humming back to life. The past 72 hours had been a whirlwind of phone calls, emergency meetings, and coordinated efforts that felt like orchestrating a neighborhood-wide barn raising. The first call I'd made after Cameron's departure was to Tommy Martinez, offering him not just his old position back, but a promotion to assistant manager with a 20% pay increase and the opportunity to learn advanced coffee preparation techniques. "Miss Aria," he said, his voice thick with relief, "I was so scared I'd have to find another job right before senior year. My college fund depends on this income." "Your college fund is safe. In fact, if you're interested in business management, I'd like you to help me develop a scholarship program for local students who want to learn hospitality and small business operations." The second call went to Luis at Hartwell Coffee Roasters, who'd been waiting anxiously to hear whether he'd permanently lost one of his oldest clients. "Aria, thank God," Luis had said when I explained the situation. "I've got 20 pounds of your grandmother's special blend that I roasted yesterday, hoping against hope that sanity would prevail. I'll have it delivered by tomorrow morning." By Wednesday evening, I had assembled what felt like a small army of supporters in the cafe's main dining room.
Miranda Walsh from the credit union sat at one table with loan documents and business partnership agreements. Dr. Patricia Vance had driven over from the university with 2 graduate students who were documenting our community restoration project as part of their research project. Bernard and Rosalie Fletcher had closed their bookstore early to join us, bringing homemade cookies and boundless enthusiasm for what Rosalie kept calling our neighborhood renaissance. River Chen had come down from the yoga studio with her evening class roster, already planning how to integrate pre-class coffee rituals with the cafe's reopening schedule. Jade Winters from the art gallery had brought preliminary sketches for a community art installation that would celebrate Willowbrook's local businesses and their interconnected relationships. This feels like what community organizing should be, Dr. Vance observed, taking notes as we discussed coordination between businesses. Not imposed from outside by developers or city planners, but grown organically from the relationships that already exist.
Miranda had been equally enthusiastic about the partnership possibilities. The credit union's board has approved not just the initial business loan, but ongoing financial services for the entire building's businesses. We want to create a model for community-supported commercial districts that other neighborhoods can replicate. Thursday morning brought the physical transformation. I'd hired Elena Rodriguez's crew from Willowbrook Restoration to repaint the walls in the warm earth tones that had made the space feel like someone's living room. The corporate black tables and chairs were donated to a nonprofit that furnished transitional housing, replaced by the original mismatched vintage furniture that I'd stored in my apartment building's basement. Luis arrived with not just our coffee beans, but also Sarah Kim, the college student Cameron had fired, whom Luis had hired temporarily at his roasting facility. Sarah had spent the week learning advanced techniques and was eager to return to Moonrise with new skills and a deeper understanding of coffee preparation. "Miss Aria," Sarah said as she carefully calibrated the espresso machine, "working with Luis taught me so much about the science behind what we do here. I'd love to develop a customer education program where people can learn about coffee origins and brewing methods." By Thursday afternoon, word had spread through Willowbrook's informal communication networks, the kind of neighborhood gossip chain that operates faster than social media and with greater accuracy than news outlets. Mrs. Holloway appeared at the front door with 3 of her friends from the Community Garden Club, wanting to confirm that her lavender honey latte would be available when we reopened. Professor Williams from the university arrived with a stack of papers to grade and a visible sense of relief that his regular study spot would be restored. The chess club members who had been displaced to the library's uncomfortable chairs sent a delegation to reserve their corner table for Saturday morning games. But the most meaningful visit came from an unexpected source. My father, who drove it from the airport Friday afternoon looking tired but determined. "I couldn't stay in Florida while my daughter was rebuilding what my son had torn down," Dad said, pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than any we'd shared since I was a child. "I should have been here from the beginning." Dad had spent his flight north making phone calls to suppliers and longtime customers, spreading word that Moonrise was returning to family management under my direction. He had also called Cameron, who was staying with friends in Seattle while figuring out his next steps. "Your brother asked me to tell you that he's proud of what you're doing," Dad said, as we worked together to restore the community bulletin board. "He said he finally understands what you've been trying to protect all these years." Friday evening brought the soft opening, a limited menu for friends and neighbors who wanted to support the restoration effort. We served Luis's house blend, Sarah's expertly pulled espresso drinks, and homemade pastries that River had volunteered to bake using recipes she'd learned from her grandmother's bakery. The response was overwhelming. By 7 p.m., every table was occupied, with customers spilling onto the sidewalk to continue conversations that had been interrupted by Cameron's week of disruption. The register showed $340 in sales for just 3 hours of operation, more than Cameron had been averaging for entire days. "It's like the neighborhood exhaled," Jade observed, sketching the scene for her community art project. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see if this place would survive. Dr. Vance was documenting customer interactions for her research, noting how quickly the social patterns had reestablished themselves. The chess players immediately reclaimed their corner, the book club reformed at their usual table, and the graduate students naturally gravitated toward the window seats.
It's remarkable how strong the spatial memory of community is. But the moment that made everything feel real came from Tommy approaching me near closing time, carrying the day's deposit bag and wearing an expression of quiet pride. "Miss Aria," he said, "I've been thinking about that scholarship program you mentioned. What if we created partnerships with other local businesses? Students could rotate through different roles. Coffee preparation here, bookkeeping at Chapters and Verse, event planning at the gallery, wellness program coordination at the yoga studio. They'd graduate understanding how small businesses work together to build community." Looking at Tommy, barely 18 years old, but already thinking like a community organizer, I realized that we hadn't just restored Moonrise Café. We'd created something stronger than what had existed before Cameron's disruption. We'd built a model that could resist future threats while nurturing the next generation of community-minded business leaders. Saturday morning's grand opening drew customers from throughout Willowbrook and neighboring towns. The local newspaper sent a photographer to document what their headline would call a community's fight for authentic business. The credit union's marketing team filmed testimonials from customers explaining why locally owned businesses mattered to them. But for me, the most important moment came when Mrs. Holloway approached the counter at exactly 2:15 p.m. and ordered her lavender honey latte, just as she had done every Tuesday for 6 years.
"Welcome home, dear," she said as Sarah handed her the perfectly prepared drink. "We missed you." Standing behind the counter where I belonged, surrounded by the people who'd made this restoration possible, I realized that sometimes the best way to honor a legacy is to fight for it. Not with anger or revenge, but with patience, community support, and the unwavering belief that some things are worth preserving even when they're under attack. Moonrise Café was more than restored. It was reborn, stronger and more community-focused than ever before. 1 year later, I stood in the same corner of Moonrise Café where Cameron had fired me, but now I was watching my niece, Lucia, carefully measure cardamom for the chai concentrate that had become her Saturday morning ritual. At 8 years old, she approached the spice blending with the same serious concentration that I'd once brought to learning Esperanza's recipes, asking thoughtful questions about why certain ratios created better flavor harmony. "Tia Aria," she said, holding up a measuring spoon for my approval, "why does the cardamom smell different when you crush it versus when you leave it whole? What do you think?" I asked, the same way Esperanza had always answered my childhood questions with more questions. Lucia considered this seriously, grinding a few pods between her fingers and inhaling deeply. "I think crushing it wakes up the flavor that's sleeping inside." I smiled, recognizing the kind of intuitive understanding that couldn't be taught from textbooks or business manuals. That's exactly right. And that's why we make our chai concentrate fresh every week instead of buying it pre-made. The conversation was interrupted by the familiar sound of the chess club setting up their pieces at the corner table. It was exactly 9 a.m. on a Saturday, and Professor Williams was already grading papers by the window, his second cup of coffee cooling beside a stack of midterm exams. Mrs. Holloway sat with 2 friends from her book club discussing their latest selection over lavender honey lattes that Sarah had learned to make with precisely the right balance of floral notes and sweetness. Everything looked the same as it had 2 years ago, but underneath the familiar rhythms lay the strength of a community that had been tested and emerged more resilient than before. The past 12 months had validated every choice I'd made during those difficult weeks when Cameron's mismanagement had threatened to destroy our family's legacy. Moonrise Café's daily revenue had stabilized at an average of $1,240, nearly 50% higher than our pre-crisis numbers, driven not by price increases, but by increased customer loyalty and word-of-mouth recommendations that brought visitors from throughout the region. The scholarship program that Tommy had proposed had grown into a partnership with Riverside University's Small Business Development Center, providing paid internships for students interested in community-focused entrepreneurship.
3 of our current employees were scholarship recipients who'd started as high school volunteers and developed into skilled baristas and assistant managers while earning college credit for their work experience. More importantly, the network of mutual support between local businesses had created exactly the kind of development resistance that Dr. Patricia Vance had predicted in her research. When a corporate developer had approached Esperanza Holdings with an offer to purchase the building for twice its assessed value, I declined without hesitation, knowing that the community anchored by our cooperative network was worth more than any amount of money. The developer's response had been to approach the city council about zoning changes that would favor chain businesses over independent operations, but they'd underestimated the political influence of the coalition we'd built. Miranda Walsh's credit union had organized a campaign that brought over 200 residents to the council meeting where business owners, customers, and community leaders testified about the economic and social value of preserving Willowbrook's authentic character. The zoning proposal had been defeated unanimously, with the council praising our district as a model for sustainable community development that other neighborhoods should emulate. But the personal victory I treasured most was still developing in unexpected ways. Cameron had returned to Willowbrook 3 months ago, not as a business owner or family member seeking forgiveness, but as a graduate student conducting research for his MBA thesis on the relationship between community engagement and small business sustainability. His advisor at Seattle University had recommended our cafe district as an example of successful resistance to corporate displacement. "I hope this isn't too awkward," he said when he first approached me about conducting interviews with local business owners. "I understand if you'd prefer I study a different community for my research." "It's not awkward," I replied, though my heart had raced during that first conversation. "It's appropriate. You're studying the consequences of the choices you made here. That takes courage." Cameron's research had led him to spend significant time in the cafe, observing customer interactions and business operations with the analytical skills he'd lacked when he'd been making impulsive decisions based on Natasha's advice. Watching him take careful notes about the chess club's social dynamics or document how the community bulletin board facilitated neighborhood connections, I could see him developing the kind of deep understanding that should have guided his management decisions 2 years ago.
Last month, he'd presented his preliminary findings to Dr. Vance's research seminar, concluding that community-focused businesses required different success metrics than profit-maximizing enterprises. Customer retention, social capital development, and neighborhood stability were variables that traditional business education rarely addressed, but they were essential factors in creating sustainable local economies. I spent a week trying to optimize our family's cafe for short-term profit and nearly destroyed 20 years of relationship building in the process. My sister spent 5 years protecting those relationships without expecting recognition or return on investment and created the foundation for a business model that's both more profitable and more sustainable than anything I'd attempted to build. After his presentation, Cameron had approached me with an unexpected request. "Aria, I graduate in May with my MBA and 3 job offers from consulting firms in Seattle. But I've been wondering." He paused, looking around the cafe with an expression I'd never seen from him before. Not the desperate panic of 2 years ago, but genuine humility mixed with hopeful uncertainty. "Do you think there might be room in this community for someone who's learned from his mistakes?" "Not at Moonrise," he added quickly. "I know I gave up any claim to this place, but maybe somewhere else in Willowbrook where I could contribute to what you've built instead of trying to tear it down." I'd been thinking about his question for weeks, watching him interact with customers and business owners who remembered his disastrous management decisions but were willing to acknowledge his genuine efforts to understand what he'd done wrong. "There might be," I'd said eventually. "Bernard and Rosalie have been talking about retirement. Chapters and Verse could use someone who understands both business operations and community values.
But Cameron, if you came back to Willowbrook, you'd be working within the network we've created, not trying to change it to fit your vision. I know, he'd replied. I want to be part of something bigger than my own ambitions. Now, watching Lucia carefully measure the last spice for our chai concentrate, I thought about the different ways people could contribute to preserving what mattered. Some people protected community by maintaining traditions, like the recipes and relationships that sustained daily life. Others protected it by fighting external threats, like the developers and policy changes that could destroy local character. But perhaps the most important protection came from the willingness to learn from mistakes, to let failure teach wisdom instead of breeding resentment. Dia Aria, Lucia said, stirring the spice mixture and inhaling the complex aroma, can I help you make the first batch of chai with this blend? Of course, I said, lifting her onto a step stool so she could reach the stovetop. But first, tell me what you think we should name this version. Every good recipe needs a story. Lucia considered this with the same serious concentration she'd brought to measuring spices. What about New Beginning Chai? Because it's the same recipe Bisabuela Esperanza taught you, but I'm learning it now, so it's old and new at the same time. Looking down at my niece, the fourth generation of our family to learn coffee and tea preparation in this kitchen, I realized she'd captured something essential about how traditions survive. They persist not by remaining unchanged, but by finding new hands willing to carry them forward with the same care and intention that created them in the first place. Outside the cafe windows, Willowbrook's historic district hummed with the kind of authentic activity that no amount of corporate investment could replicate. Customers moved between businesses with the comfortable familiarity of people who belonged to a place that belonged to them. Children played in the pocket park while parents conducted community business over coffee and conversation. It was exactly what I'd been fighting to preserve, strengthened by the knowledge that it could survive challenges and emerge more resilient than before. Moonrise Café had become more than a family business or even a community gathering place. It had become proof that some things were worth protecting, even when, especially when, that protection required courage, patience, and the willingness to fight for values that couldn't be measured in quarterly profit reports. And as Lucia and I began the slow process of brewing our first batch of New Beginning Chai, I knew that the legacy would continue, carried forward by people who understood that the most important ingredients couldn't be purchased from any supplier. They could only be cultivated one relationship at a time, one cup of coffee at a time, one generation at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.